We're going to go ahead and get started, even though people are continuing to dribble in. I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you all for joining us, and also say to those who were part of our annual conference 2 weeks ago, thank you so much for coming to that. That was our first ever virtual conference, and it was a really big undertaking for our tiny team, and we really appreciate those of you who came along for the ride and hope you got a lot out of it. So now we're back to simpler programming, although today's session is going to be making some creative use of virtual meetings. And we're really excited to be able to focus on our workgroup events more. This event is one of our workgroup events, as I think you all know. Today's event is an event put on by our policy and learning workgroup. And that work group is co-chaired by Lane Pollock and Emily Janik. Lane is Senior Learning Advisor for the Bureau for PPL at USAID. And Emily is Director of Knowledge Management and Learning at CARE USA. And we're really grateful to both of you for bringing this terrific event to us today with some wonderful speakers. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Emily to get you going with today's event.
All right, so first of all, I'm going to say thanks so much to our speakers, Zachary McKay from USAID, Barbara Phillip from Kemonix, and Ingrid Orvidal from RTI. And we're really excited to have them. They're going to be doing just a little speaking at the beginning and then move into breakout groups. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask our speakers, if you can put in one sentence in the chat box what the topic of your breakout group is going to be today. That will allow all of the folks who are on the line to see that and start thinking about how they want to use that. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Next one. So the first thing we're going to do is set up some expectations. So we're just going to do a quick poll. And the way this works is there's something called Mentimeter. So you can see here at the top, if you go to www.menti.com, and then there's a code to add, which very creatively Zoom has blocked, so I can't read the code out loud to you based on the way my screen is showing. But it's those 6 numbers there at the top. And just give us in one sentence what you're hoping to get out of the session today. If you're having any trouble accessing it here, then you could drop it in the chat box instead. Ooh, exemplary examples. That's a little intimidating. Empathy, creativity, community. That's great. We're really going to try to spend some time in breakout rooms so people get a chance to talk to each other and build a little community here. Insight. Anybody else? We'll just let this run for a couple more, maybe 30 more seconds. People have a chance what they're hoping to do today. Solutions. Creative mindset. Knowledge. All right, last chance to drop something here in the poll before we move on. And I see in the chat, Roxanne has said a system for sharing solutions. Good to know. All right, So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. Thanks everybody, and we'll do a little bit of a poll after we come back from breakout rooms to hear about what you've learned and if you think you've gotten some of these things that you were hoping to get out of the session today. So if we can go back to the other slide deck. And next slide, thanks. So today what we're doing is a peer assist that's going to help us think about the challenge of surfacing, synthesizing, sharing, and applying lessons learned. And we said it a little bit in our description. Everybody has read the report that said, here's our lesson learned, we should be better at partnerships, and thought, well, yeah, what exactly does that mean? What do I do? What happened? Like seriously, how did this become your lesson learned? So how do we get better at this? How do we have the conversation where we understand when you read a lesson learned, it tells you something useful about what you need to do next, and it really captures all of the hard work that that project did to understand and adapt and change. So the run of show today, we're going to do a little bit of a brief introduction. Barbara is going to take us through that about lessons learned and how that works and how that fits into sort of a cycle of learning. We're going to then split people into breakout groups. So what's going to happen is each breakout group will be together for about 50 minutes, and halfway through we'll switch from one topic to another. But because sometimes people get lost in the digital shuffle, reassigning breakout groups, we're just going to stay in one group. So if you can see in the chat box, Ingrid's topic for her breakout group is ensuring global learning frameworks are relevant and realistic for individual and country level activities. Zachary's topic is how to capture and apply lessons learned at the organizational level. And then Barbara's is about project to project knowledge sharing. So as you're thinking about it, the easiest way for us to arrive at breakout groups that you get to pick what topic you want to be in. If one of these topics really excites you or jumps out, you should change your Zoom name to indicate which of those ones you want to be a part of. So for anyone who doesn't know, the way you change your Zoom name is if you hover over your name, there's a button that says more with a little arrow. And when you click that, the first option is rename. So it allows you to then change what you're doing. And I could say, project to project learning, and then that's what shows up for me instead of my name. So that will help Zoom, the folks from SID who are orchestrating things today get you into the right Zoom rooms. So you'll have a little bit of time to do that as Barbara's presenting this brief intro. And then before we go into groups, each of the facilitators will do a little bit of a conversation about here's the scenario and here's why you should come join my group to talk about what we're doing today. And what we're hoping is that people will really get a chance to talk about solutions and really brainstorm. These are all problems that are live in progress for our facilitators. They're not things that they have a perfect answer to. So this is a chance to really bring some ideas to the table and think about how we could change what we're doing in these spaces. Next slide. And then I should say, after we do the breakout rooms, we'll come back into the plenary session. We'll do another poll, and then we'll do a quick report out for what's happening there. So Barbara, over to you.
All right, thank you, Emily. So I wanted to provide a little bit of broader context around lessons learned, because I can be quite passionate and opinionated about the nitty-gritty of how to write lessons, good lessons and all that, but in the end, we need to have a bigger picture. So without going into definitions of knowledge and learning and all of that, I tend to see knowledge as the capacity for effective action. And Emily was already talking about what's the point of lessons learned that are essentially very generic messages. Like how do we make our knowledge and lessons really actionable? And I think of learning as the process of acquiring new knowledge or modifying existing knowledge. And beyond that, sometimes we also need unlearning, but we don't need to get there right now. So if learning is a process and knowledge is about action, we can see that I'm already using very active, dynamic words, precisely because we need to continuously make use of our existing knowledge, acquire new knowledge, to take effective action. Therefore, we're talking about a continuous cycle of learning. So it's all very dynamic, and knowledge is not static either. So knowledge is not static, learning is very dynamic as well. So how do we actually learn? How can we enhance our individual learning, our team learning, project learning, and organizational learning? So next slide, please. This is a simple diagram that we've used in the past to explain in simple terms, even though the actual learning process is not that simple, how people learn in the workflow, in the process of doing their work. So most of what we learn is actually learning by experience, what we learn from working on a particular project, working in a particular region of the world. We just learn by doing. And perhaps putting numbers on this is kind of dangerous, but maybe 80% of what we learn is actually just learning from experience. And then we learn by engaging in conversations, in dialogue, by asking people within our network. And so we learn by connecting to our network, to people we know. So we learn by ourselves, through experience. That experience usually involves talking to other people. So that learning process is more of a social learning aspect. And the broader and more diverse our network, the more we connect to other people's experiences that are dissimilar to ours and may enrich our learning. So experience, our network, and then the third component, the third circle in that Venn diagram is we learn from accessing things that have been documented, our explicit knowledge. And this is where you may have repositories of project documents or research papers, technical briefs, all kinds of things. And that's also typically where you also have your lessons learned repository, if you have a lessons learned repository, or if you have lessons learned embedded in reports or anything like that. Those would be in your knowledge bases. So the danger in a lot of lessons learned activities is to think we're just going to capture, put it in a lessons learned database, make it, tag it, make it very organized, and then expect people to use it. If we do that without taking into account the other components of this learning diagram, the learning by doing and the learning through the networks, it's unlikely that the lessons learned process or lessons learned repository is going to be very useful. Next slide, please. So and this relates to the bigger picture that I wanted to convey, which is that we can't rely entirely on knowledge stocks or databases of lessons learned or other kinds of documents. We really need to find a way for our lessons learned process to be more like learning flows or knowledge flows and be really more dynamic. And so in the conversations that we're going to have around specific scenarios, I hope that we can all start thinking in terms of different stages of a lessons learned process without separating them too much, but seeing them as a whole. Like, how do we capture the lesson? How do we store it? How do we eventually use it? Like, how do we make sure that we think in terms of a cycle rather than just the capture itself as the key component of the approach? Next slide. So that's kind of just summarizing what I'm trying to say in those few slides. Thinking in terms of lessons learned processes as part of a broader knowledge management or learning context, where learning happens both at the individual level, at the team level, at the organizational level, and even beyond, but within a cycle and a very dynamic learning environment. That's it. That's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. So because you're already talking, I'll have you start first. If you can do a couple of sentences of introducing yourself and your background, and then a couple of sentences about why people should join your group to talk about your scenario today.
Thank you. So Barbara Phillip, I'm the Senior Advisor for Knowledge Management within Kemonix. It's part of a unit that also deals with innovation and data and outreach, so it's not just knowledge management within the unit. My background is a little bit of monitoring, evaluation, and learning more than a decade ago, then focusing a lot on knowledge management in a different industry, and then coming back to international development to focus on organizational learning, knowledge management things. Lessons learned is a big topic of frustration for me, so I love to talk about it. And my scenario is going to be something I am working on right now that's going to happen with an event next week, which is a knowledge sharing from one project in Georgia to a project in the Philippines. So one project is at a stage of maturity where it can actually share lessons with the project in the Philippines that is more in a beginning stages. And so there's an opportunity there. They're both dealing with something very similar around e-commerce platforms. So there's a commonality. The regions are completely different. There's all kinds of things to think about in terms of how can we facilitate the exchange of lesson and the capture and all of these different elements that we're talking about. So I hope that a number of you can join me to have an interesting conversation around that. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. And as a reminder to everybody, as the panelists are explaining what their small group is going to be about, go ahead and change your name in Zoom to indicate which of the groups you'd like to join. Thanks to everybody who has started doing that. Zachary, why don't you go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Zachary Bakke. I'm Senior Knowledge Management Advisor for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID, where I have been working on knowledge management and knowledge management related things since 2008 when I joined as a American Association for Advancement of Science, Technology, and Policy Fellow. And I started out in the Office of Agriculture there and then continued into the Bureau for Food Security and now into the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. I've been covering, knowledge management, training, data, a variety of tasks on the learning team. And one of the challenges, as Barbara also highlighted, is the lessons learned. And we've had this challenge in trying to capture lessons learned at both kind of the initiative level, since our bureau oversees the Feed the Future initiative, and trying to figure out, across the global level how to do lessons learned. But another really challenging problem has been, how do we as a bureau learn? How do we capture our learning across the different offices and centers that we have and share that learning, and where do we integrate that into our processes? Right now, we are looking to implement what we're calling an evidence cycle to get into, again, what Barbara had mentioned about using, a cycle of kind of knowledge and sharing, and what does that look like, and sort of implementing that now that we've transitioned into this new bureau and sort of making that a part of our function. And so I'm ready to swap notes and ideas and thinking around both that sort of evidence cycle and then what the things that you're doing at an organizational level around lessons learned. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Zachary. Ingrid, over to you.
Great, thanks, Emily. My name is Ingrid Orvidal. I come from RTI. I see some friendly faces in the room. So I work at RTI as a senior learning advisor within one of our divisions inside our international development group. And so that's been really interesting, working with different projects and seeing how they're approaching this idea of lesson capture and sharing. But my background is really in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning space. So I approach this a little bit differently. And prior to coming to RTI, I spent the last almost 10 years working with different USAID missions and supporting their monitoring, evaluation, and learning functions. So working with staff and implementers to try to improve skills and capacity and figure out how we can do some of these things more efficiently and more getting more out of each of those pieces. So my scenario is a current global program that I work with at RTI, trying to operationalize a learning agenda that came from the global program level, but then ensuring that it's translated or adapted or accepted by the 13 individual country programs that fall under that umbrella. And I can tell you it's been a real struggle. So I am very interested to hear people's brainstorming ideas around how we can make that connection work a little bit better. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Ingrid. And I think you've heard from all the panelists, these are all problems they're currently grappling with. This is the kind of thing that if there were an easy answer, we'd have a panelist or a class instead of a peer-to-peer learning assist. These are all people who are very senior and have been doing this work for a long time, and it's still a challenge. And how to do this well is something we're all trying to improve all the time. And I'm sure Lane and I could both come up equally with therapy sessions of things that, like, boy, I am just struggling to make this work right now. So please bring your ideas, and we're really going to have some open discussion, and then see what kinds of recommendations and solutions we can bring back to the broader group. So what we're going to do now is split into the groups. If you've had a chance to indicate in your Zoom name which group you want to go, SID will break you out. If you don't have a preference there, that's fine too. We'll just split you into a room, and there will be an opportunity if you get into a room and you think, oh, this isn't the one where I wanted to be. You can leave the room, and then SID will reassign you. So that's something you can be aware of. What we're going to do in the breakout rooms is, as we think about that knowledge cycle of how do you plan for what you're learning, and get learning from other places to apply to what you're doing now. How do you kind of capture and articulate and adapt learning as you go? And then how do you sort of document and save it so that it could be used again or used in a different place? So each of the hosts will sort of present their topic in more detail, and a little bit more, they'll do a little bit of a warm up and introduction section, because we know part of the goal of something like this is building community. So we'll have a little time and space for that at the beginning of the sessions. And then about halfway through, we'll rotate from one part of that cycle to a different part of that cycle, depending on what's interesting to the group, and think about what are solutions and how can we apply them here. And then after that, at about 2:10, we'll come back to the group and do plenary breakout plenary and sort of recap and discussion. Two things to note. When you get into your group, please assign a note taker and somebody who's going to report back to the plenary session. So you have been warned. We would like people from the group who aren't the facilitators to speak up about what they learned and what happened. And then we also will be recording the small group sessions. The SID Washington team has very cleverly figured out how to record 3 simultaneous breakout groups. So those recordings will be happening, and there will be somebody from SID in your session taking notes. They'll also be live tweeting. So if you are interested in live tweeting, SID will post that and share it also out through their networks if you hear anything you're excited about. So the hashtag to use there is SIDW Live. So that's the run of show. Lane, have I forgotten anything, or any of the colleagues from SID who are in charge of logistics? Did I make your life harder in any way?
For my part, you hit all the notes, Emily.
Great.
Thank you so much. And thanks to our discussion hosts for being willing to offer up the thing they're struggling with, because we think it'll, as you said, provoke some really lively conversation. And then when we come back, I'll be leading the plenary readout. But thanks, Emily, for walking through all that.
Yes. I do see there is a note here about Chatham House rules. And we are recording, and there will be notes that are released live after. So plan accordingly. I can tell you our rule of thumb at CARE is you're not allowed to blame partners for anything, and you're not allowed to, so you can say whatever you need about the failure that you personally are responsible for. You can't blame other people, but that might just be our official rule. Not everyone else's. All right, so looking forward to the discussions, and for whoever is, I think it's Paul who's sort of making the magic happen on the back end, I think we're ready to go.